Does John 1:18 say that Jesus is God or that Jesus is the Son of God? Well, if you've compared English Bible translations, you may have noticed that there is a discrepancy in the way this verse is translated. Some translations have Jesus as God, and some have Jesus as the Son of God. So in this video, we're going to look at some of those translations, and then I'm going to show you the ancient manuscripts, and we're going to talk through the reason that this discrepancy exists in different English translations. So let's look at the King James Version. It says, "No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him." So John 1:18 in the King James Version has Jesus as the only begotten Son. Now, the RSV is similar. It says, "No one has ever seen God. The only Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known." So, but what about the ESV? The ESV says, "No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." So the ESV doesn't say anything about the Son of God. It just says the only God. Now, some translations try to combine both. The NASB says, "No one has seen God at any time. God, the only Son, who is in the arms of the Father, he has explained him." The NIV says, "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." And finally, the New Living Translation says, "No one has ever seen God, but the unique one, who is himself God, is near to the Father's heart. He has revealed God to us." Well, why do some of these translations have Jesus as God, Jesus as the Son of God, and why do some have Jesus as both the Son and God? Let's look at some of the ancient manuscripts and see what the issue is. So the first one I want to show you is the Codex Alexandrianus from the 5th century. And I've underlined John 1:18 in green, except that I've underlined in red the part where it is different from some of the other ancient manuscripts. So underline in red there is the word huios, which means son in Greek. So the Codex Alexandrinus says that Jesus is the only begotten Son. And so not only does this manuscript say Son, but the majority of Greek manuscripts that we have say Son here. And so some people might conclude, well, if the majority of Greek manuscripts have the word Son, then shouldn't we just translate the word as translate the verse as the only begotten Son? Well, in textual criticism, when we're trying to figure out which verse is most probably the original, or which wording is most probably the original, we don't always just use the majority of texts. There's a variety of factors that go into evaluating which one is probably most close to the original. So let's look at a couple of other ancient manuscripts that don't have Jesus as the Son. So here's the Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century. And so this is John 1:18 underlined in green. But you'll notice the part that I've underlined in red, it says theos. Now that's an abbreviation for the word theos, which means God. So this says that, well, you can translate it differently, but the way I've translated it is the only begotten God. It doesn't say anything about the Son. The word huios is not there. So this is the only begotten God. So this is an earlier manuscript than the one that we looked at before. Now, just because it's earlier doesn't necessarily mean it's not the one in error. You know, some earlier manuscripts may be in error. But let's go even earlier than that. We're going to look at Papyrus 66. This is from the 2nd or early 3rd century. And I've underlined John 1:18, and there I have underlined the verse, the word in question, and here it also says theos, which means God. Now, some may say, well, huios and theos, hey, it's really, close to the same word. It sounds kind of the same. Yes, but there's a pretty clear difference. There's a few letters difference in the way that it was written. So it's unlikely that this was an unintentional error, although it's possible that it was an unintentional error that was introduced somewhere in the text. But anyway, this clearly says theos, and we have some other early manuscripts that also say theos. For example, another important manuscript is P75. P75 also has theos, and so does the Codex Vaticanus. So we have some very early important manuscripts that have the word God instead of the word Son. So on one side, we've got the majority of Greek manuscripts that have the word Son, and we've got a minority of manuscripts, but older manuscripts and good manuscripts that say God. So this is why some translations differ when we're looking at translation history. The King James Version was translated from the majority text, and so it maintains the word son. And then some of the newer translations, where we have used some more newly discovered ancient manuscripts, have translated it as God. When the King James translation was made, we hadn't discovered P66. We hadn't discovered Codex Sinaiticus. So those were more recently discovered manuscripts. So the translator of the King James did not have access to the manuscripts that we have now. The age of the manuscript is not the only thing that goes into evaluating which reading might be closer to the original. We have a variety of things that textual critics use to try to determine which reading might be authentic. So one of the things that is used is the quotations of the church fathers. If we destroyed all the New Testament manuscripts that we have, we could still reconstruct the New Testament, I think most of the New Testament, or if not all, from just the quotations of the church fathers. So there were lots of manuscripts written by the church fathers that we still have. And in their quotations, we can evaluate what they understood to be the authentic reading of the text. Now, with this passage, John 1:18, we have church fathers that use Son, and we have church fathers that use God. So the church fathers in this case are not really helpful in determining which word is closer to the original text. So we have other ways that we kind of try to figure it out. And one is just by thinking about what might have been in the head of the scribe. Now, granted, this is guesswork, but it's educated guesswork. So textual critics will look and say, what would be more likely for the scribes to do? Would it be more likely for them to adjust the text in this direction or adjust the text in this direction? Now, some people will get scared when I say the scribes adjusted the text, but it is true that scribes sometimes did make intentional changes to the text when they thought it would clarify or add something to the text, okay? So there are intentional changes made by scribes that we have discovered, and this might be one of them. So there is some reason to think this could be an intentional change by the scribes. Well, which would the scribes be more likely to change the word to God or to change the word to Son? Now, some may say that, well, it's more likely they would have changed it to God because, hey, that bolsters the deity of Christ. But there's plenty of other places in the New Testament text that describe Jesus's deity. It's unlikely that scribes would need to bolster the deity of Christ by introducing a new phrase, which is used nowhere else in the New Testament. And in 3 other places in the New Testament, we have Jesus described as the only begotten Son. So it's more likely that a scribe that's copying would make this into the sun. Instead of theos, he might have thought that was confusing and may have just introduced a phrase that he knew was in other parts of the New Testament and just written it as only begotten son. Now, there's also the possibility that it was an unintentional change, just the scribe was already familiar with the term only begotten son, and that's what he wrote down. But anyway, like I said, this is one way that evaluating this kind of evidence is one way that textual critics try to figure out what the original was. But, in some places we just don't know, okay? However, for this particular passage, with these the most ancient manuscripts all in accord on this, it does seem likely that the original was God, that that was the original word that was there and it got changed to the Son. So that is why we have many modern translations that have Jesus as God, because the evidence is heavily weighted in favor of God being the original reading. Now, some people may get nervous about discrepancies in the manuscripts because, hey, isn't this a divine book from God that just came down and every word of it is perfect? Well, if that is your view, then you are mistaken. Every Bible scholar knows that there are discrepancies between the manuscripts, and we have to work hard to try to figure out what the original was. And in some cases, we really don't know. Now, the good thing is that there aren't that many passages like this where there's a substantive difference, there's a substantive discrepancy between the verses, but there are some. But, the things that are taught that are core to the Christian faith are taught many times. And so we don't have to just depend on this one verse to figure out if Christ is deity or not. So it's not something to be too concerned about, but there are places that we are unsure. And this is one of those places where we're not completely certain, but we do have a pretty good idea that God was the original. So anyway, I hope this video was helpful. If you liked it, please subscribe to this channel and let me know if you like these videos where I look at the manuscripts, because this is one of my favorite things to do. I love this stuff and I'd like to make more of these, but it is a lot of work to look through the ancient manuscripts and get this kind of information. So please do let me know if you enjoyed it. God bless you and thanks for watching. His own self for heavenly food.